This is like late night on Saturday, so everybody's already trashed. Yo, what's up?
Hey, you came to our panel, you might as well come to yours.
Cool. Has anybody here been to any of my panels before? I've done a couple. I did, at Mag Prime this year, I did a panel on PC game optimization, and then the year before that, I did SteamOS and Linux game development, like sort of the tool set. So we might, since we can probably retread that, honestly, because how I was thinking I might be able to do this, depending on the turnout, was if anybody had like game sources that they just had like with them, that we could just sort of work on it just up here. Like if they wanted to work on like controller support, which is why I have like all of these with me, or things like big picture compliance, because I have a lot of experience doing that since I shipped for SteamOS most of the time. And just whatever, like, because I work at like the engine level pretty much all the time. My main work right now is an implementation of. Most of my work these days is an implementation of XNA called FNA, which you can actually see here, which is shipped in like, I think we're at 60 something. I haven't done a count recently, but it has stuff like Charlie Murder in there and Fez and what else? Solaroid's the last exploit game ever to ship is using it on the PC. Full Metal Furies is using it. If anybody knows the developers of Rogue Legacy, their next game, which is I think is supposed to ship this year, I actually don't know the exact date, but they're still using it. Blitworks, who does a lot of like ports to consoles, like a console version of like Axiom Verge. I think they're working on Owlboy for Switch. I think. They use it sort of internally. They just take all the C# stuff and convert it to C++. Because it's better than dealing with like, managed language on a piece of crap console. So I'm assuming there's really no source that we can work with. So pretty much the way that I'm willing to do this is like, we can do sort of Q&A on engine level stuff if people are curious about how that works and how it would work on the PC specifically, especially with like the living room where you can have 3 controllers, different types of controllers connected at once. Or it can just be like, if you want like dumb stories, I probably have quite a few after 53 games shipped. So if anybody has something they want to talk about, just go for it. Anything at all. We could be drinking right now instead. Well, I guess one thing I could talk, since I have these up here, I may as well use them. One of the things that's really hard to pitch for SteamOS, and one thing that's been really difficult for us trying to advertise it as a far more open platform, is the fact that when you look at Steam machines and how they're advertised, it's always advertised with this. I really like this controller a lot. I know that's basically a wrong opinion, but
I love that thing.
yeah, I have a lot of uses for it. But I also have a lot of uses for this, and I also have a lot of uses for this. And everybody has different use cases depending on how they play. Like I'll use this for like when I'm running stuff through like RetroArch or something, and then this is for like I actually use this for both CS and TF2 amazingly. I mean, I was never good with keyboard and mouse in the first place. It was a low bar to reach. And I might be able to show a sample of why it's really important to have support for all of these. Because when you think about, like, on the PC, we don't have a cert process, for example. Like, the only thing that really comes close to a cert process is when you're trying to ship on Steam, you basically just give them a build and they review it and they say, oh, like achievements don't work, or like you say cloud saves is on, but we actually don't have it syncing between like Linux and Mac specifically, or some weird case like that, because they do actually now have sort of a small test suite to work with. But some of the things that they don't really test on, but they probably should, is compliance with different controller types, because of course, that's the one thing that SteamOS has that other consoles don't. And I actually spent a lot of time dealing with this, and in FNA, I actually have extensions built into it to specifically do something like this, for example. So actually, no, you don't really need sound for this. So we're just gonna start, oh, did I just open up Wonderboy? Well, while that's loading up, I think I have a cable for, oh no, I don't. like we get to test pairing on stage. Well, one way you typically see settings, and this is one game that I worked on that does controls in a specific way, is that gamepad settings. Yeah, so basically there's just like an option. Wait, is it really? Oh, shoot. You guys can't see anything that I'm doing right now. That's a little weird. Explains the... Huh? Is it here? Okay, so that explains quite a lot.
Hey,
Display settings.
there you go.
Okay, so yeah, I have one display setting.
Drag it over there.
Actually, you know what? I can do that. So let me just go and I think I can...
It's happening. Oh,
Nope. Okay. Where'd my mouse go? Thank you. So I'm like looking at it from this angle. Let's see how robust my Mac version is.
no.
Well, it was kind of robust. There we go. All right. So now I have to like, we're gonna have to do it like this. So, oh wow, the resolution is totally messed up on this display. But if I go to controls and then, am I on gamepad settings now? So most of the time you just have a setting like this, where it's just like, you literally have a thing that says Xbox One, X360, PS4, Steam controller, and so on. Which is kind of crappy because A, it doesn't auto-detect, so the first time someone's playing and they don't know what the symbols actually mean, it totally loses them. And second, for multiplayer games, this is basically a no-go entirely. So if I... Okay, so I will put... So let us do this. So again, you're not going to be able to see anything because I have like the settings done in a different way. But if this loads, this is actually a game where I have the settings done correctly, so I can actually just, instead of doing a weird drag and drop, I can actually set it on the right display. Do I have it connected? Yeah, okay. So if I go into video settings, which you can't see, did I just soft lock it?
Welcome to technical difficulties at MAGLabs.
Oh yeah. Because I think the last time I did this, like the HDMI splitters they use, they're not like splitters even. Like they're just this weird intermediary thing where like it doesn't let you mirror, but sometimes the only thing that lets it show up on the screen is if you mirror it, and then yeah, that's a shame. Oh yeah, totally hard locked. Oh well. I actually have a screenshot of it, I think. So let me just do it that way. I'm, again, doing things totally behind the scenes. But I do have pictures of stuff that I can show you. Because one thing that you can get from direct input, for example, as opposed to X input, is the hardware ID. This is something that kind of got lost because they just assume that you're on the 360 controller all the time. But on macOS and on Linux and with direct input, you can actually get like the vendor ID, the product ID of the version and stuff like that, and how it's connected. And so if you actually take that information as things are hot plugged in, you can get per controller information if you know what the hardware ID is. So like, I have like in my brain 4C05 C405 is DualShock 4. Like I just know. And 4C05 CC09 is DualShock Slim. Like you just get used to it really quickly. And when you have that information and you know how to draw individual prompts, because usually when you're drawing your HUD, for example, you're usually drawing things in a specific order, not necessarily on purpose. It's like you draw like the top HUD and then you have like player prompts 1, player 2 prompts, player 3 prompts. And you can kind of set up your engine in a way where when you're rendering for a specific controller, you can look up the controller hardware ID for that player index, and then you can just pick the correct sprite sheet for your icons. And so if I can, oh God, how many things have I shipped? Because I have to like go back into all my old posts and be like, oh yeah, I wrote, oh, that was like December too, so this is gonna suck. Where did I put it? Did I put it in the images, maybe? I'm trying to get like a visual example because, oh no, here it is. Yeah, okay. This is a really long thing. So like I have a Patreon account, and for a little while I was posting like port logs, and in this case I was doing a port log of the Dishwasher, Vampire Smile, and Charlie Murder after I had worked on Salt and Sanctuary. And that game was like hard-coded as hell for the Xbox 360. So the majority of my time, in addition to doing like keyboard and mouse input, was like it was like the 1280s and 720s were hard-coded into like the graphics subsystem everywhere. So like he gave me a build that was like, yeah, I think I got all of them. And as soon as we got to the mini games, like they were just like all over the place, and you were doing all this weird ass scaling that didn't make sense. And I think we spent like, I think he spent a year getting rid of the ones that he found, and I think I spent another 6 months doing even more just for one game. Okay, so here's how we're going to do this. I'm going to move this. Oh, well, is this going to work? Okay, so I honest to God cannot see. So I'm going to have to like, there I am. So one example of like, I think this is the keyboard and mouse. I honestly cannot see. Shoot, I honestly can't see what that looks like. Why can I not mirror my displays at all? Oh wait, are you serious? There we go.
Nailed it.
macOS. I should preface everything I do today by saying I'm a Linux user, and this MacBook is basically just my build target. It's the only laptop I have, though, so this is what we're using. So this is a really good example of like how the hard coding was really affecting us. Like I'm trying to enter like keyboard prompts, and so this is going on, and then this is going on, and then I don't remember what this one was. Oh yeah, this is going on. Because like basically, literally, I'm just inserting text rendering into spaces where he thinks like a 64 by 64 button's gonna go. So there's like all this like shitty overlap going all over the place. And so one good reason, in addition to getting good prompts just for like controller front ends, like getting A to be X in the right context, but like having A to be like left mouse button, you probably want to get that as soon as possible, because otherwise you have to undo this. And if you don't remember how that stuff works, because it's usually the first thing you implement, you're going to be like, I have no idea what's happening. I'm just have to rewrite it. So you're basically just like doing your entire like menu subsystem all over again. And that's almost what we did. Oh yeah. So this is like sort of some of the stuff that I was, like you can read all about this. It's mostly just about like trying to get clever with like how you set things to be anchored correctly, so you can kind of trick it into not knowing it's 64 by 64 and just, oh yeah, here's another example. So like you would just have the whole thing be text, so it actually just rendered text instead of buttons. But that's all like really, really obnoxious and specific. The stuff that I actually wanted to get into was, that was keyboard. Oh yes, this is what my Patreon looks like. Kind of looks like every other Patreon page, including that. Thanks, Patreon. Your site is as good as your logo. Thanks, Patreon. I pay you good money for this. Let's see. Yeah, so this is how often I post. So I try to make it at least a little bit valuable. If you're like an XNA developer or like an Xbox Live Indie Games developer, trying to kind of get some value out of bringing back your old dumb games that everybody hated because they were Xbox Live Indie games and got, kind of pooled together with like those weird like, basically I just call them gratuitous anime boob games is kind of what people associate with Xbox Live Indie games. But then there's stuff like, Bleed and Charlie and Dishwasher, for example. Okay. I think this is it. You can tell that I shipped too many games because this shipped maybe like 3-4 months ago, and I've already forgotten all of it. Blah, blah, blah. This is all just code talking about button actions. Okay, so this is where we start getting into it. So this is a really good example. So you normally check for like, is controller or is keyboard and mouse by doing just like, okay, so is the gamepad connected? And then you can actually look at the hardware ID, and in this case I do 4C05, C405. And then you can actually just like store somewhere in memory, like, okay, the controller that we just connected at this slot is going to be a DualShock 4 as opposed to a 360, and you can of course add more buttons depending on which hardware IDs you know. And so now, I'll explain. So you can have a scenario like this, where you can have hotel Wi-Fi. Really? This is the half I did not care about. Hey, we made it.
Okay.
Eventually.
Just need some dial-up noises.
See, I would open up a YouTube video that had those sounds, but I'm worried that would make it worse. Well, while we're doing that, we're going to load another one and make it worse. But like, this is a really good example, actually, where, so if you look at player 4 and player 2, those are the original 360 graphics. And then on the player 3 is the fixed up PC keyboard and mouse graphics. And then at the time, I actually did not have PS4 graphics from James yet, so I went and found like the most stock looking like button graphics I could possibly find. And those button graphics are actually PS4 graphics as placeholders that are completely wrong. So in real time, you can actually have, for example, like right here, you have like the PC prompt for like the health pickup. And then you have health pickup for the PS4 player. That's technically supposed to be R1, but again, just got a goofy graphic. Really? But it's such a tedious sounding thing, and it took me a god-awful amount of time to not very properly explain. But it's something that doesn't have a cert process, and being able to show people that you can have the 3 different controllers plugged in at once and all of them have the correct prompts meaningfully, and so you're not stuck playing with a controller that you absolutely hate for that console, people react to that pretty positively. It's a shame that that kind of gets overshadowed by something like this, as much as I like it. Most people don't even want to look at it. They're just like, why touchpads? This is not an iPhone. Is usually the reaction that I get. What else? I'm trying to think of what else I could talk about. I suppose I could. Do I still have my slides up somewhere? No, I don't. So I guess instead of talking about graphics, because that's painful and difficult, I will dig up some stuff that I was drafting a little bit after my panel on optimization and kind of bring out some of that stuff. Because I think it's still relevant to PC game development, and it's a little bit relevant to sort of engine development, especially if you start getting away from things like Unity and Unreal, and or if you're working with Unreal, because you at least get source code with that. There's a lot you can think about instead of, because most people think about like gameplay and stuff, and like pretty much every panel that's been here has been mostly about like either getting started and then mostly thinking about the high level, whereas my reason for doing these panels is that I think there's some value in being able to present something that's about the low level a little bit more. And I would explain that more, but Wi-Fi, man. But, I mean, I guess has anybody come up with any more topics? Like, I'm willing to kind of drift off into that, because I mean, I'm really just kind of going into all of my notes and kind of going over stuff that I've either talked about or written about before, and sort of, yeah, what's up?
I've been working on indie games since XNA as a teenager, and I've moved on to mono game. I've been hearing about FNA lately, which I'm very involved with.
I'm the author, so.
Yeah, what is the advantage of that over something like mono game, or do they work in tandem? I don't really understand exactly what it is.
So actually, you know what? That's probably a much more interesting story. So what happened with FNA is that I was given the contract in 2013 or so to work on Capsized. And that was an XNA game, and that was back when Monogame was really the only choice, and that was before, I think that was like right before they were shipping 3.0. And I was in charge of doing the Linux and Mac versions. And so I'm thinking, okay, I mean, I had heard of Monogame too, and so I gave it a try, and I downloaded the Linux version, and it did not even compile. Which, like, C# projects don't take that long to compile. Like, it's like a second. And so that was warning flag number one for me. But this was back in 2013. I could, as an addendum to everything I'm about to say, the Linux version of Monogame has improved quite a bit since I kind of rewrote the entirety of it. But this was like, it was using OpenTK. It had like GL bindings that were just like all completely trashed. The GL calls they were making was like they were calling bind to buffer 0 16 times in a row because I still don't know why. And so there was a point where we were really just tearing it apart so much. And by the end of the project, which like I started in January of 2013 and shipped it in May of 2013, and we completely wrote the platform backend from scratch. And that was what, if you look like at old posts from like Monogame forums and stuff, you might see something called Monogame SDL2. So that's what it originally was, which is basically just our attempt to only rewrite the platform backend and try to give everything else back. And then eventually we were planning to get Monogame SDL2 in mainline. The problem is that I shipped Capsized with Monogame SDL2, and apparently it kind of got sent around to the indie scene that there was, and I swear to God this is true, the version of Monogame that worked. And so from I think Capsized shipped May 28th, 2013. That was my first XNA shipped game. May 29th, 2014, my 15th XNA port shipped. So it just like, it could not have been a more instant hit. Like, it was kind of nuts. But the problem is that in doing 15 games and then doing another like 10 the next year, I pretty much rewrote everything aside from like the content subsystem. So like the OpenGL subsystem was totally different. The exec subsystem I rewrote. I've rewritten twice, and I'm about to do it a third time. Like the reason that I ended up forking it was not just because I had totally rewritten it and there was no sense sending patches back, but because it was becoming abundantly clear that the reason I had to rewrite it and they didn't want any of those patches was because everything I was doing was because it's supposed to be a preservation of XNA. So like when you take an XNA 4 game and you link it to FNA, it should work exactly the same, like beat for beat. And in fact, we actually have tools. There's a German developer who wrote a tool called XNA to FNA. And what it does is I think I might even have a prototype here. I do not. But basically what it was is he takes XNA games on Windows. Like he took Cthulhu Saves the World, and he actually just today took Duck Game. He took the Windows version, he sent it through a tool that just takes the whole binary apart through C# reflection, reassembles it, linking to FNA instead of XNA, and he runs it on Linux natively. So we can do like prototype ports in like a couple minutes without the source code, which is really nice for pitching. But you can't do that if you have a framework that's not API compatible with it. And Monogame tries to be the success. Well, this is sort of one of my problems with Monogame, is that it wants to be the successor to XNA, but it's making too much money off of XNA ports to do that right now. Because right now, the majority of the revenue coming from the people who actually lead development on it are working on XNA ports, not new stuff, working with Monogame and finding ways to benefit from new technology. Like, if I was the developers of the Monogame project, I would completely rewrite the graphics system from scratch. Because that was like, for those who don't know, XNA 4's graphics API is designed around Direct3D 10, but it's implemented with Direct3D 9. And that kind of has interesting implications because A, the API doesn't make sense for the backend, and it actually breaks the backend in multiple ways because the way in which those APIs actually function individually contradicts with one another. So that's kind of why XNA has a lot of problems internally. Like if like the half pixel offsets are still there, so your shaders wouldn't have actually been compatible with DirectX 10, even though it's a DirectX 10 API. So it was just like a huge mess. It's probably why they stopped developing it, because they just hit a huge wall. But like, if you were thinking about like a high-level framework like Monogame, where you would want to take like a high-level graphics API that still has stuff like Sprite Batch, for example, for like 2D games, and have it just run on top of Vulkan, DirectX 12, and Metal, you could do that really easily with a C# API that just takes, for example, make a class that compiles the entire render state as a single object instead of having blend state, raster state, depth stencil state, plus like all the other extraneous sampler states and blah, 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 blah. There's a lot of things you could do as a successor to make that a lot better, but they're not doing that because that would break compatibility, and compatibility is where their revenue's at. So I would encourage Monogame to be a successor, but until then, basically they're competing with me, and basically other than console support, which Splitworks does for me, I kind of think I'm better, but I mean, of course I'm going to say that.
Right.
So.
I just didn't know exactly what it was, and I guess it makes sense that you started working on it before Monogame became a bit more robust.
Yeah, and I don't know how to pronounce his alias, but it's crazy, but with a 0 in the middle somewhere. And then there's Helmet, who's developing Neurovoider. But those two have been really hauling ass on Linux and Mac support, and they've really turned it around the last like year or two. It's still not ideal. There are a couple things that I would do differently, but I mean, they're smart guys, they'll figure it out. Oh, that was a rant. Did that even answer the question at all?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, feel free to try it. Like, pretty much, like, we're mostly compatible with the Monogame content pipeline. The only thing that we aren't compatible with is shaders. Instead, we don't use MGFX. I actually use Direct3D shaders directly, because I basically re-implemented the Direct3D framework. So we actually are compatible with like the original XNA shaders without like weird like shader model workarounds or shader array workarounds. Like I figured out how to reverse engineer pre-shaders so you can actually have pre-shaders so your CPU can do a lot of the work that your GPU would be doing senselessly, so you get some optimizations there. To be fair, that's like one of those things that I definitely would not do in a successor to XNA, because pre-shaders are basically just a cop-out for your shaders being slow. But, you know, I guess I could actually, can you guys see that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool. I think I spelled that wrong. Yes, I did. But yeah, like, so actually, yeah, I can show you. So like, do you use Sprite Batch at all?
Yes.
Okay, so like, a really good example of how that sort of thing works, and a really good example of like, if you wanted to debug MGFX, for example, like you have really complicated shaders, a really good way to do that is to compile your stuff to like native Direct3D bytecode with FXC. So in this case, I'm going to use Wine because it's just a shader compile, who cares? So you do Wine FXC, like fxc.exe, you target FX20 because it's the latest version of the FX framework for Direct3D 9, because it's basically their limit, because their system uses Mojo Shader, which is what we also use, but we do it at runtime rather than compile time. So you look at Sprite Effect, for example, and then you can, in addition to getting like shader binaries, you can actually look at the assembly directly without having to worry about like the converted output from MGFX, for example. So you can see exactly how like all the vertex attributes. So if, like basically what Sprite Effect does is it just takes position, color, texture, which is what we have here, and then you can look directly at the assembly. More interestingly, when you can look at that, which is what you know works because it's the DirectX compiler. So what it is that's like what's supposed to be the output. And then you can look at the output, which is what I already have. So if you look at the MGFX output for the same thing, if you open it up with like a hex editor and you look at the text, you can take apart that binary, and this is the GLSL version. So you have the OpenGL shaders working pretty much the same. And you can kind of see like here, it's roughly the same as what you see here, it just looks a little different because, of course, the languages are different. And so like if you ever run into like weird shader bugs, that's a really good way to do that. Is just take the effects framework that's in mainline Mojo shader, disassemble that, and then take FXC and then build it with that compiler and kind of compare the differences and see if there's like an inaccuracy somewhere. Because MGFX is definitely, they admit that's one of their systems that's kind of the least developed because it's probably the hardest problem to solve. And there are things that like, I don't know how exactly they intend to solve it, but there's also like metal, for example, in case you like target that at some point. We're currently working on Spear V support, so we're going to try and get like direct 3D bytecode working with Vulkan, which is kind of feels like overkill, but you know, why not? So that's one thing you could look at, and of course, if you ever have questions about that, even if you're like a monogame developer and you're interested in that sort of thing, you can always talk to me because again, since they're not a successor, our problems that we're trying to solve are pretty much the same. So I'm willing to kind of bring in any insight to that I can. Is there anything else? Let's see. Oh, geez, it's only 9:30. I am just tearing through stuff. And by tearing through stuff, I mean I'm improvising okay. Unfortunately, in order to like, I wanted to kind of open up possible questions if anybody's interested in like specific games, but of course you'd have to know all of these games to even know what to ask. So I don't know. Recently shipped Pyre. I'm actually working on the Linux version of Dream Daddy, so that's a nice change of pace for me.
Congratulations on that.
Oh yeah, having that next to Pyre is gonna be awesome. Yeah, so I did a report of the Linux version. It's going to be a report of the Mac version as well, and I'm also working on basically all of the PC versions for simplified Chinese support. And so the Windows builds are actually going to be using FNA now. We're bumping from XNA 3.1 to FNA because it's actually just more uniform and it doesn't change system requirements really at all. So it actually fixes a lot of problems too. So yeah, that's a lot. That one's really interesting because that's because you think about the amount of audio in that game. Like that game has audio for days, and they used to use Exact, which is one of the tools that like. If you've not heard of it, there's a reason, and the reason is that it's like, oh god, it's so bad. Just the build times for like I think Darren Korb like at his GDC presentation for the Bastion audio, I think he complained specifically that like trying to rebuild the dialog wave banks took hours to do. So now they use Fmod, and they used to use Fmod for like the Linux and Mac version of Bastion, but the version was so old, I was just like, fuck it. I just took it out, replaced it with OpenAL Soft, and just kind of got on with my life. So you can actually, if you take like the modern versions of Bastion, it's all just Ogg-Vorbis, so you can kind of go in and look at the raw data. It's not, I mean, it's all like, it's obfuscated by way of not making any sense unless you just know what the numbers and file names mean, but you can just kind of open them right up and listen to the raw data. That's a little secret for you all to have. Yeah. And as a footnote to that, if you don't support Chinese language, you probably should, because right now China is like, there are many cases where China overtakes the United States in purchases on Steam. The Asian market is exploding right now, and I'm sure someone who's researched the data probably knows why, but for most of us in the indie scene, we're like, we added Chinese language support and our sales quintupled. That's kind of cool. So definitely look at CJK support, because it's definitely not the same as like Arabic character support. It's just absolutely insane. Is there anything else? Because I mean, again, this is mostly just improvised. This is like a late night MAGFest thing. This is mostly an attempt to do an experimental panel. So I'll just talk about whatever that's related to PC games. Sure.
Actually, did Justin
Yeah.
And so, what are you doing exactly? Do you work with the team who helped us in like?
So what I do is, for basically how it works is that there are games that are just only for Windows, and then, particularly with XNA games, like my name just gets kind of passed around, and they're like, hey, we need a Linux version of the XNA game. So what happens is I'll get a source drop, and sometimes I work with the team. Like for Pyre, I was working with them alongside the game's actual development before it launched because we were doing launch day for Windows and Linux at the same time. So usually I'll like commit to their repositories unless there's some specific reason, like you would not believe. Like here's one thing I kind of wish you guys had talked about in your panel was version control.
He knows about version control.
You better, boy. Do you know how many people in the XNA scene like still use fucking Dropbox for revision control?
I was proud of myself for using like Unity Colab here and there. I still need to get into GitHub, stuff like that.
Well, I mean, whatever. It's like Subversion, Git, like SDL uses Mercurial, which, oh god, don't make me use Mercurial. Like, but you know, version control is really, really important, and you would be shocked how many people in like. You think about Dustin Lizzie and Tail. The most fascinating thing about that was like, I was like, hey, where's your source repository? He's like, here's a zip file. Have fun.
I feel like that's something I would do too, is the scary part.
As soon as you get used to version control, though, you can't live without it. And there's a reason, because it saves your ass so many times, especially if you're like crunching and you're working on your like, I remember I was working on a project where I changed 100,000 lines in a week. If I didn't have revision control for that, I would have been so screwed.
I can think of a lot of places where if I just had some kind of like instant way to go to a backup of a certain thing, I would be in such a better place.
Yeah.
I don't keep them nearly as much as I should. I'll keep like a backup of every major-ish version.
Yeah. And it doesn't. And the great thing is that it doesn't really cost anything just to keep every version and just commit early and often. Like, and like, who cares if the commit log has silly things like. You look at the FNA commit log, I do some really dumb things in there. And then you just, you know, fix it like one line later, like, gee, maybe I should have compiled this first before I sent it off to GitHub. But, I mean, yeah. You'd be surprised how many games at scale like don't do stuff like that. But then I'm like, okay, look, I will personally give you like a Subversion repository on my server. For the love of God, please use it. Especially when you have gigabytes of data, like, you know, like Dust's wave banks, I think, are like 1 gigabyte on their own. Because that game doesn't have nearly as much like audio as, I think, well, no, Bastion compressed it differently. So that's probably why that game was a little bit smaller, because for some reason, like they made a format called XWMA. I have no idea how that format works, but apparently it's a thing, and nobody had heard of it before, and nobody's heard of it since. Like, I think it exists in Xaudio too, sort of as a compatibility thing. I don't know if it's something that people actually ship with anymore, but because it's not even XMA, which is something that makes sense on a 360, because the 360 had dedicated hardware for decoding a specific format that they developed, so you could actually save cycles by decoding specifically their format on, I think it was like on the South Bridge, where you could just, I think that was one of those things I think Bungie sort of kind of coerced them into doing, because I think they probably had the most voting power, especially with audio. I think a lot of like the Xbox's like advances in audio were basically because Bungie told them to do something. Or so the legend goes. But, you know, so yeah, that's like, it varies as far as like teams go, especially because the teams are often one person. So basically by having a contractor, they're doubling their team size. So, but yeah. Yeah, Argent Fez. Oh, I don't know anything about Fez 2. Most people who worked on Fez don't know about much about Fez 2. So I really don't have any. Yeah, I don't really have any much insight into that. Most of my work on Fez was like Linux and Mac versions, and then I worked on the Fez 1.12 update. This is the one that adds like really, really nice visual options. It adds DS4 prompts and hardware instancing and all these really cool things that nobody will notice. But, you know, now the game runs on like an Intel Atom tablet, which is a proud moment for me. But yeah, we're kind of just improvising.
What's up with this? What did I walk into?
You basically walked into me trying to figure out how to make a PC game development workshop without any code to work with.
Nice.
So basically we're just kind of just like, we can talk about questions you have about like how to make a PC game work in like the living room, or like this is like my list of games that I worked on. If there's any game in there that you want to talk about, like I'm fine with whatever, because this is mostly just a panel to just talk about game development. It's not really meant to be some super academic thing. Most of my panels aren't.
That's fair.
So, any version. How many people have played a version?
No, I don't even know what it is.
Go get it. It's $5 and it's really fun. It takes an hour to play and you'll love every minute of it, especially the endings. Super Hexagon.
You worked on Super Hexagon, you said?
I did. I worked in the Linux version. Yeah, I really love talking about that game, especially in the context of like, because I also work on games like walking simulators, for example. There was a panel about that yesterday, actually. I don't know if anybody went to that. Because two people were talking about like what isn't in a game, and like length is such a common thing to talk about, and I'm like, you know, most people, like, think about Super Hexagon. The average length of that game for most people is about 3 seconds, but people still love it. So I mean,
Yeah.
it's like it's one of those things where people try to establish like really high level rules, and you can just like take a game like Super Hexagon and just like throw it immediately out the window.
I've never understood the idea of trying to come up with this big, complex set of rules to define what is and isn't a game. To me, it's something simple, like it's a series of interesting decisions. That's always been my definition.
My definition, after having worked on so many different genres of games and like having no idea how to explain it, like I work on Pyre one day and then I'm working on Dream Daddy the next. Like it's just, forget it. The only rule I have is basically if it was intended to be released as a game, it's a game. So like Aliens Colonial Marines, not sure if that's a game. Or let's see, Duke Nukem Forever. I'm not sure if that was really intended to be released as a real game. Or say again? Allegedly. I don't really know. But like, say again.
Half-Life 3 script count as a game.
Probably.
I mean, somebody had to go in, they had to edit all of the names that he like wrote into it to avoid using the official name. Technically, there was some interactivity with
I
it.
think the way that I would define games is interactive entertainment.
Yeah.
Because you can make a game out of a TV show. Like, as you're watching it, you put, like, the mustache on, and you're like, the mustache lines up with his face.
And like, what's funny is that like then like entertainment starts to come into question too, because then you get like serious games. But is that like flashy or like entertaining in like the sort of not gimmicky, but like the
Yeah, I know what you mean.
I feel like as long as you're interacting, it's still technically a game in that it can be a really lame game. Like it can just be bad. Like it can be gone home, walk around the house for an hour, and then find out your sister's gay is the big dramatic reveal, not interesting type deal.
But at least you were doing something.
Yeah.
So out of every like project you've done, what was your favorite to work on?
Oh damn, that's a really hard one. Eversion is Eversion is one that I really liked because it's the only game I've worked on that uses Ruby as its scripting language.
Whoa.
I've never run into it. I'd never run into it before, and I've never run into it since. I have a Ruby build on my build server just for this one game, and it's actually surprisingly painful to build. Basically anything Supergiant. I love working with Supergiant so much. And then I'm trying to think. Because I ship an average of like 10, 11, 12 games a year, so it just becomes a blur after a while.
And on the same topic, what was the most difficult or problematic one you did?
Vessel. That's actually much easier to answer. Vessel was definitely difficult. Vessel was a project that like I mean, you can read about Vessel Linux if you Google it. There's all kinds of news posts about how I basically just totally screwed the pooch on it. It was the engine was gorgeous. Like, I still look at that engine, like, it's C++ heavy, which I'm not too big a fan of. I'm kind of a pure C kind of guy, but like, that game looked really nice. The engine looked really nice, but because it was like so big and so complex, like, and because it was mostly developed in Visual Studio, as soon as you enter GCC into the equation or Clang into the equation, just like everything just started to stop making sense. There was a bug where like this character here, like the little fluoro guy with a little eyeball, the eyeball would either go missing or it would just become a lazy eye, like it would just drift off into space, and then it would just crash the game. And the reason that would happen is because the game uses Lua internally, and the way it interacts with types is that it actually has like a super heavily templated system, and it has like templates for like T1 and then T1, T2, T1, T2, 3. And so like for some reason, what it would do, maybe I can like actually, so yeah, we can do that. So it would have like, it would have func T1, T1, T2, T3, like literally that would be, and like the types would be like the parameters. And what would happen is that with the Visual Studio compiler, what would happen is that it would just like, it would allocate what it needed, it would send it off to the function, everything would still, like all the places in memory would be just fine. Problem with that is that that's actually wrong. Because the way these functions work, these are actually in a block of code local memory. Because they're not being dynamically allocated. That would be new T2, for example. So what would happen is that we would create in GCC and Clang, it would go and build all the stuff. It would send it all the functions, everything would be fine, and then it would immediately destroy it all as soon as you left the function. And so certain things would be left, certain things wouldn't be. There would be just like, it would basically effectively become uninitialized memory, and then eventually it would find something that was like technically a seg fault and it would just crash. I don't remember how I fixed that. I don't remember if I actually did. 100%.
Can you just make it so it saves long term?
I think I tried like deep copying and trying to do like weird ass pointer fix up, or I think I tried to, because the funny thing is I wanted to just do new T2, but with certain types that didn't work because the templates, all of the types didn't align. This was the only way that it would even compile, let alone run. And so I think if you still run the Linux and Mac versions, I think they're still lazy eyes. Like I think they still drift off into space every now and then, but I think it mostly doesn't crash. But probably, maybe. I think the last build of that game I made was in 2013, and maybe I'll get back to it someday. But yeah, it was tough, and I always feel bad about it. But it was definitely fun to look at that engine for sure. I just wish that I was competent enough to be able to figure out what the hell was going on. Let's see. Probably the second worst one was Hacknet. Not because of Hacknet. Hacknet's source, I think I had working on Linux in a weekend. Problem is that it uses a web browser in its, as part of its design. And I needed a portable browser because in C# you can actually have system.windows.forms. I think there's actually like a web browser. Probably shouldn't use it because it uses Internet Explorer, but it's there. And so I had to figure out how to port that, and my solution was Chromium. And I regret ever doing that, but there's no other solution. And so like you look at the download for the game, it like libcef.so is like 100 megabytes just for that one file. And oh God, I really hate the web so much. I'm really glad I did work in native code.
I've always been curious of the like behind the scenes of how Hacknet works, because it is such an interesting. I love those like meta hacking type games.
Yeah, it is pretty interesting. They basically it's basically like a little OS written in C#, but with a very limited subset of things. A lot of like the innards of like the file system and things are kind of flubbed, but like.
It's a file system.
Yeah. Like I mean, a really easy way to figure out how the game works is to go into the data files. The data files tell 99% of the story about how it works.
What I was going to ask is about, you said it uses Internet Explorer. does a new update of it maybe use Edge?
Well, I mean,
Not better, but it's.
well, I think I'm actually not sure because I think isn't Edge like a full screen? Is it a full screen app?
No, it's it acts like any other web browser would. It is one of the UWPs.
Yeah.
But for what it is, it's actually a pretty competent browser.
Yeah, I think.
Reading PDFs.
It's a
Oh.
good PDF reader.
It's a great PDF reader.
No,
Okay.
It works as a great like baseline browser. I prefer something like Firefox because I like the plugin support and
Right.
the other little stuff added on top of it.
And it's not Internet Explorer, which I mean, deep down we know.
Edge is Internet Explorer,
I'm
Yeah.
actually pretty sure that it is completely separate from it. They just kept a similar aesthetic just so that the old folks who just want to get on the internet still know where to go.
Possibly. I don't know.
Like that's the whole reason they decided to call it Edge instead of Spartan, just so they can still keep the E as the logo.
Yeah.
but. Oh.
I don't know. Microsoft has a really difficult time with names.
Sometimes they do it really well, sometimes they make questionable decisions.
And sometimes they do it so badly that we get Xbone and we can all enjoy ourselves.
The
Just
XXX Bone 1XX.
there was a wonderful picture online of like it was one Xbox and then there was one Xbox box, then there was one Xbox one Xbox One box, one Xbox One Xbox X, like it basically like
That's trash.
I saw that. It's
I know that
fantastic.
meme.
Interesting question. Have you ever gotten a chance to name a game?
have I?
Or have you ever been a part of naming a game? Pretty much just strictly programming.
I'm basically programming. If I've ever contributed to any name, it would be a game written by someone called Cheese. Josh Bush. He worked on the Linux versions of Full Throttle Remastered, Day of the Tentacle Remastered. He does a lot of independent stuff and a lot of like free open source software. So I think he's contributed to Godot. That's another engine that's free that people ought to know about is Godot. It kind of falls into the Unity and Unreal kind of space, but it's definitely like it's fully free, and the guys that are working on it are pretty competent. And the editors on Windows, Mac, and Linux. I don't know what platforms they target, but I mean, you do have all the source, so it's not too painful to get to it. And since it builds with Visual Studio, GCC, Clang, you get pretty good coverage because most people aren't shipping like crazy ass ghetto compilers anymore. Like even on consoles, like I'm pretty sure it's pretty obvious that they're all using GCC or Clang at this point, other than Microsoft. But you kind of knew that already. So what time do we have? So we have like 9 more minutes. Since it's late and y'all could be partying right now, I'm willing to just take a couple more questions and then we can just kind of bounce. Sure.
It's like working with multiplayer games, as in for stuff that has to go with like the programming behind that for people.
Yeah, so multiplayer is pretty, for me, multiplayer is actually, it's a lot of fun. I like single player games personally, but getting to work on multiplayer games is kind of fun because it lets me do kind of weird things like multi-prompt support and things like that. I've actually worked on networked multiplayer a few times. Charlie Murder and Dishwasher were really interesting because I had to re-implement like the Xbox Live gamer services and network APIs with Steamworks. And I mean, I got it pretty accurate, but the problem is that those games like technically didn't have the best networking, so it's hard to tell if I was accurate or if I screwed up because sometimes there would be like weird things. Because the thing about networking is that it's in my opinion, networking is the hardest thing that you can do in an engine, like by a pretty good margin, because that's like the least determinate type of code that you can write, like by far. Because even like crazy, really difficult things like physics, like a lot of the difficulties with physics isn't necessarily with determinants. It's more just like, sometimes floats suck, but like you can kind of get a pretty good idea of how things are going to work once you have it working, and then a lot of the problems are really just optimization. But like networking networking is basically just like all the problems that threads have, but just on crack. Because at least with threads, it's all in one system. Now it's just all kinds of weird beat patterns, or things just get dropped, and you have to figure out how to compensate for that. You have to figure out like how things have to get throttled if you have to throttle it. Figure out, if the packet size is gonna fuck with anything. Like it's. I'm really glad I don't have to work on network multiplayer very often. Usually by the time I get to it, it's already multi-platform, and I can just kind of ship it, and like it can just go, and I can kind of go back into my little corner where I'm with OpenGL or something. Yeah.
Have you worked on any cross-platform kinds of stuff?
Uh,
That work with,
what type? Because my job is cross-platform, so.
like,
Like something like Rocket League.
yeah, like that kind of stuff.
Like what?
Something like Rocket League, where,
Where you can
say,
play with console users.
Oh, yeah. So I actually don't know the specifics about how console and like console and PC crossplay is. Basically, as far as I know, the way you have to do that is have some way. Like Steam does have like linking to PSN and so on, so that might be how they do it. But like a lot of the rules as to why like cross-play networking doesn't happen, I'm sure there are some reasons for it. Like I'm sure Xbox Live, like the way Xbox Live APIs work, to my understanding, like you can't just go to a random IP and just connect to it. But at the same time, I mean, if you have a master server and you're doing matchmaking anyway, there's a lot of the cross-play, like it's kind of arbitrary. Like networking is networking. There's not a whole lot of ways to do it differently anymore. Like there used to be like in Windows, but like now it's pretty much like Unix sockets and all that kind of junk.
It's all contracts now, basically.
Yeah.
Sony doesn't like doing crossplay with Microsoft.
Yeah, which is it doesn't really, I don't know. I hope something like Destiny, something really big like Destiny 2 and just comes and just throws that like out the window, because a game like Destiny 2 would really need something like that. Because even in MMO, like if you're a really popular one, you still need like every single player to add to the volume, because otherwise you're screwed.
Minecraft couldn't do it, then I can't imagine what else big could come along.
Yeah, I mean,
Because Minecraft is able to do Switch and
Rocket League.
Xbox.
big names.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the only one on board with that was PS4.
Huh. Yeah, it's so weird, especially now because we're seeing like how companies interact with indies, for example. Like sometimes like you'll get like this huge burst of like, man, Sony's so great, and then you get this huge burst of, man, Sony's not so great. And it always fluctuates, and I never really understood why. Of course, only recently did I get I'm doing like Switch and Xbox One targets now, and so I'm finally sort of seeing sort of the innards. Obviously, I can't really talk about those because it's all under NDA, but like, from the perspective of someone who works on open platforms all the time, like entering the closed ecosystem and seeing just like how painful it is for basically your only return on it is revenue and not any sort of like long-term thing. Like once you ship that SKU, you're done, because like even if you wanted to ship a patch, that patch is going to cost like 40 grand because it's got to go through cert, and if you change a string, it's got to go through localization. The localization's got to get certified, and that's going to cost a whole lot of money. So we really like the PC for that reason.
Have you done anything with the Switch at all? I'm curious.
Right now, it's mostly just experimental. Like I'm trying to get FNA running on it. Though the FNA is already running on the Switch by means of like managed to native translation, but I'm seeing if I can get like a CLR to run on it and see if I can get like an FNA binary that's like typically built for Linux. Just take the FNA.dll, swap it out, put it on the Switch, and it should in theory run. But that's highly experimental, and that's probably one of those things where you really just do it to get it booting on the console, because I'm sure that thing will run out of memory so fast. So we have a couple minutes. Anything else? I mean, really, this is just me with a mic. I'm willing to just keep talking outside because I think there's something in here after this. And anybody know what's after this? I think it's that like interactive video thing. What was it called?
Video karaoke,
Videoke, yeah, that's what it is. So hopefully that'll be more fun than this was for you guys. So it'll be interesting to see how the recording of this looks, because this was like pretty improvised. Hopefully you guys got something of value out of it. This wasn't what I was intending to do, but you know, MAGLabs is for kind of improvising, and I mean that's just MAGFest in general, but you know.
Improvisation and technical issues. I'm sorry.
I was about to say was that for speedrunners. It's like curiosity. It's probably something very stupid, but is there like a character who moves fastest among all of them?
I actually don't know much about the gameplay speedrunners. That was a game that a lot of my effort was spent on, like optimizing the audio subsystem and the graphics subsystem. They had some undefined behavior here and there, and so, you know, because they had like this really interesting setup where like a lot of their high level code was interchangeable between XNA and Unity, which is how they have their console versions. So like that was an area that if I definitely couldn't touch, because if I did anything wrong with it, then it was going to break the console versions, and whoever's running the integration is not going to be happy with you. Yeah.
Have you looked at porting things to WebAssembly as a platform?
Yes. So I actually have web prototypes running. So and there's actually I don't know how much I can talk about this, but it's okay. I don't know how much I can talk about this, but there are people working somewhere to basically make it like the XNA to FNA thing that I was talking about, where you could just reassemble to work it with Linux. There's actually seems to be some work starting regarding taking XBLIG games and preserving them by way of reassembling them as WebASM with FNA. So that's definitely a target I'm thinking about. We are one thing that FNA does that Monogame doesn't. Another thing I just remembered this is that we don't have different builds for different renderers. So if you want, so basically with FNA.dll, there's only one DLL. That one DLL gets you Windows, Mac, and Linux with the same binary, gets all those proper save locations and all that, so you don't have to do rebuilds. Gives you OpenGL, OpenGL-ES, OpenGL Core, OpenGL 4.5 compat, Direct3D 11 via Angle. And we're planning to add Vulkan and possibly Metal Direct if the Vulkan Portability Initiative doesn't give us Direct3D 12 and Metal for free. So.
Impressive.
I'm glad someone other than me thinks that. So yeah, that's kind of all the time I have, but of course, basically if we want to just keep doing this, but like 5 feet away, I'm down with that. So thanks for showing up, everybody.